was adrift in a sea of his own making, a sea of deceit, betrayal, and shattered dreams. At the end of his shift, Camden gathered his meager belongings, stuffing them into his worn leather briefcase. The weight of the case felt heavier than usual, burdened by the weight of his failures and the uncertainty of his future. Just as he was about to leave, Captain Reynolds, for the first time ever, walked into his office. As usually, everyone is summoned to his. He closed the door behind himself, the click of the latch echoing in the small space. Reynolds remained standing, his towering presence filling the room. Camden started to rise to his feet, but Reynolds gestured for him to remain seated. "Stay put, Bradley," he said, his voice low and serious. Reynolds paused, his gaze fixed on Camden. "I commend your gusto in this case," he said, his tone measured. "You've shown a real dedication to bringing down Cassidy, but I'm starting to have some serious concerns about how invested you seem to be. And based on today's spectacle, with his daughter as well." Camden met Reynolds' gaze, his jaw tight with determination. "Sir, I assure you, everything is above board," he said, his voice firm. "I understand your concerns, but I promise you, I'm not letting my personal feelings cloud my judgment. You have to trust me on this." Reynolds pressed his lips together, his eyes narrowed. "There has to be something else, Bradley," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "Something you're not telling me. What is it?" Camden hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't keep Reynolds in the dark any longer. He had to confide in him, to share the burden of his past and the motivations that drove him. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to reveal. "Sir," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "there's something you need to know." Camden began to share his story, his voice low and tinged with a hint of shame. "When I was a kid, around 6 or 7 years old, I was getting ready for a fishing trip with my father over the weekend. I was so excited, you have no idea." He paused, his eyes meeting Reynolds' gaze. "Sir, do you remember my father, the late Deputy District Attorney, Daniel Bradley. He asked rhetorically, knowing the answer. Well, my father always wanted to take Cassidy down. It was all he lived for. Camden continued, his voice gaining intensity. On the morning of our fishing trip, my father, who was a senior prosecutor at the time, had just left the house. My mother and father had been having one of their loud arguments, which I assume this time must have been about the fishing trip. When my father and I reached the fishing store on Morey Street to stock up on supplies, he spotted Cassidy walking by. He paused again, his face etched with pain. My father told me to wait in the car and proceeded to approach him. They exchanged a few words, which quickly became heated. Then Cassidy raised his arms and turned to walk away, which is when my father reached out to grab his arm. At that point, being that Cassidy was at the peak of his violent ways, he struck my father with such a thunderous slap that it threw him to the ground. Everyone gasped and stopped in their tracks. Camden's voice trembled as he recounted the humiliating scene. While my father reeled on the ground, clasping his face, Cassidy calmly walked to my window, threw in $100 bill, and said, "Give that to your mother, son. Tell her it's to take care of your pappy." Then he just disappeared down the street. Reynolds shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of disbelief and understanding. "I heard about that incident," he said, his voice low. "I used to be a beat cop at that time. It was all over town." Camden continued, his voice filled with raw emotion. "You have no idea the absolute shame I felt at the treatment of my father. The humiliation that washed over me at such a young age. That shame has stuck to my family name, following my father beyond the grave. It's been a shadow over our lives ever since." He met Reynolds' gaze, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "So, sir, I'm out to set things straight, to finish what my father started, to restore our family name and bring Cassidy to justice, once and for all." The captain looked deeply into Camden's eyes, a flicker of something akin to understanding passing across his face. He tipped his hat in a gesture that was both respectful and ambiguous. Without uttering a single word, he turned and walked out of the office, leaving Camden alone with his thoughts. That evening, after shedding his uniform for more casual attire, Camden found himself drawn to the pick and pocket. He felt a need to confront Cassidy, to test the waters, to see if he could glean any information from the man himself. He found Cassidy sitting at a table in a dimly lit corner of the pub. He was wearing a set of reading glasses perched on the end of his nose and had a pen in hand, working on a crossword puzzle. Camden bought a beer at the counter and approached the table. "Mind if I join you, Cassidy?" he asked, his voice casual. Cassidy merely gestured to the empty seat with his pen, without looking up from his crossword. Camden sat down, placing his beer on the table. "Evening, Cassidy," he said. Cassidy glanced up, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Evening, Camden," he replied, deliberately ignoring the unspoken correction. "Officer Bradley," Camden corrected automatically, his voice tight. The two men exchanged brief pleasantries, a tense dance of veiled intentions and unspoken threats. Then Camden cut to the chase. "So, Cassidy, where were you last night?" Cassidy sighed comically, rolling his eyes. "Oh, not this again," he said, his voice laced with mock exasperation. "You're persistent with your interest in my bedtime rituals and routines, Officer Bradley." "I locked up the pub and went home, as I always do." "Can you prove that?" Camden pressed, his gaze unwavering. "Do you have an alibi?" Cassidy, without lifting his head from the crossword, nonchalantly replied, "I was with my daughter at home, going through the books." Before Camden could respond, Cassidy put down his pen, peering over his glasses at him, his eyes suddenly hard and cold. "And where were you last night, Camden?" Camden choked on his words, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. Cassidy's face changed, his expression hardening into a menacing scowl. He pointed at Camden with the pen, his voice low and dangerous. "Stay away from my daughter, son." He then dismissed Camden with a wave of his hand, pushing his glasses back up his nose and returning to his crossword puzzle, effectively ending the conversation. Not without muttering to himself as he fixed his eyes. 9 letters fourth letter B. Not allowed to be done. Camden knew that confronting Cassidy directly would be a futile exercise. He needed concrete proof, something tangible that he could use to build a case against him. He decided that surveillance was the only way to go. The following day, he enlisted Nancy's help. She agreed to assist, using her personal vehicle to avoid drawing attention. Camden felt a pang of guilt involving her in the case, but knew he needed someone he could trust. They parked near the Pick and Pocket and waited. Cassidy stayed put at the pub until just after noon, then drove off in his car. Camden and Nancy followed at a discreet distance, careful not to arouse suspicion. As they tailed Cassidy, they noticed something interesting. A few cars ahead of him, Lilian was driving her own vehicle. Cassidy appeared to be traveling with her in separate cars, maintaining a consistent distance to throw off their joint travels a few cars back. Lilian stopped outside Macomb Machinery, a tool and small machinery shop on the outskirts of town. She got out of her car and walked inside while Cassidy stayed put, watching from a distance. She exited the shop shortly after, clutching a brown envelope in her hand. She got back into her car, and both she and her father drove off in separate directions. Camden was faced with a difficult decision. Should he confront the store owner at Macomb Machinery, or should he chase down Cassidy and Lilian? He needed to decide quickly before they disappeared completely. He weighed his options, the clock ticking away. He realized that he still had no concrete proof of anything. He decided that it would be more prudent to wait, to gather more evidence before making a move. He didn't want to risk blowing the entire operation. He also didn't want to spook Lilian and risk further damaging their relationship. But by the time he reached his decision, the two cars had disappeared out of sight. They were gone, vanished without a trace. Camden cursed under his breath, slamming his fist against the dashboard in frustration. With no other option available to them, Camden and Nancy were forced to return to the precinct, empty-handed and defeated. Camden drove to his mother's house, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. He was worried, not just about the case and the lack of progress, but about Lilian and what she might be getting herself into. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was in danger, caught in a web of her father's making. His mother, Marlene, a keen observer of his moods, immediately noticed his unease. "What's bothering you, darling?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Camden tried to brush it off, beating around the bush. But Marlene wasn't easily fooled. "Is it about that girl you took on a date?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. Camden's silence was confirmation enough. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated, Mom," he said, his voice weary. Marlene took his hand, her touch surprisingly strong. "Then uncomplicated," she said, her voice firm. "Invite her over for dinner. Let me get to know her. Sometimes a mother's intuition is all you need." Camden hesitated. "It's not that easy, Mom," he said. "Things are complicated." Marlene smiled knowingly, her eyes twinkling with the wisdom that only years of life experience could provide. She spoke in a soft voice. "Hark, my son, for love is a battle where the bravest hearts do clash, and 'tis only by the might of thy spirit and the strength of thy devotion that thou shalt claim victory. If thy heart doth yearn for this maiden, then fight for her. For the tapestry of life, love is the most exquisite thread." Her words struck a chord with Camden, stirring something deep inside him, as her poetic recitals usually do. He knew she was right. He couldn't give up on Lilian, not without a fight. He nodded slowly, a flicker of determination returning to his eyes. "Okay, Mom," he said. "I'll call her. I'll invite her over." Camden dialed Lilian's number. He held his breath as he waited for her to answer. "Hello?" Her voice was soft and tentative. "Lilian, it's Camden," he said, his voice equally soft. I wanted to apologize for what happened at the precinct. I was out of line, and I'm truly sorry." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, and Camden's heart sank. He feared that she would hang up, that he had ruined everything. Then Lilian spoke. "It's okay, Camden," she said. "I was upset, but I understand." Relief washed over Camden in a tidal wave. "Lilian, I was wondering, would you like to come over for dinner tonight? My mother would love to meet you." Another moment of silence stretched between them. Just When things were looking up, Lilian replied, I can't. Camden's spirit plummeted. I can't, she continued, because I don't have my car. But if you could fetch me, I would love to come. Camden's excitement soared. Really? You would? Yes, Lilian said, a hint of amusement in her voice. I would. I'm on my way, Camden said, barely containing his eagerness. He arrived at Lilian's house, his heart racing with anticipation. He knocked on the door, and in the distance, he heard Lilian calling out, Come in, it's open. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior of Lilian's house was a stark contrast to the gritty world of the tire shop and the pub. It was decorated in pastel colors, with whimsical paintings of stars and galaxies hanging on the walls. It felt like stepping into another world, a world that reflected Lilian's unique and ethereal spirit. He peered around, not seeing her. Lilian, he called out. Her voice came again, closer this time. Camden, could you do me a favor? Could you bring me that makeup bag on the kitchen counter? He looked around and spotted the bag on the kitchen counter. He picked it up and walked towards the sound of her voice. He reached a closed door and hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should knock. Then he opened the door, and his breath caught in his throat. Lilian was standing at the foot of her bed, stark naked, her skin still glistening with moisture from stepping out of the shower. He stood in absolute awe, speechless, his eyes devouring the sight before him. He described the beauty of her body to himself in detail. The perfect curves, the delicate lines, the radiant glow of her skin. It was a vision of pure, unadulterated beauty. She stood there calmly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She extended her hand, her gaze unwavering. Bag, please, she said softly. Camden, on the verge of shaking, numbly handed her the makeup bag. I'll be out soon, she said, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. Go find something to drink in the fridge. Camden turned and stumbled out of the room, his mind reeling. He was completely and utterly overwhelmed. A short while later, Lilian emerged from her room, transformed. She was wearing a flowing, beautiful green summer dress that danced and played about her skin as she moved. It accentuated her figure and highlighted her eyes, making her even more radiant than before. They arrived at Camden's mother's house, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Camden was anxious about how the evening would unfold, while Lilian seemed calm and collected, radiating an inner peace that belied the turmoil of her life. Camden's mother, Marlene, was busy in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on dinner. She heard them enter and greeted them from the kitchen, telling them to take a seat at the dinner table. She popped her head into the dining room, intending to offer a warm welcome. But when she caught Lilian's face full on, her eyes widened with shock. When Camden entered the kitchen to help her bring out the food, Marlene pulled him into the corner, her voice a hushed whisper. Is that Cassidy's daughter? Before Camden could answer, Marlene continued, her voice laced with fear. She shouldn't be here, Camden. You should take her far, far away from this house and stay away from her. She's not for you. Marlene's face was contorted with seriousness, her eyes strict with shock. She didn't even realize she was squeezing Camden's arm tightly, her grip bordering on painful. He jerked his arm out of her grip, his own anger rising to the surface. Mom, calm down, he said, his voice tight with suppressed fury. You're being rude. You can't judge Lilian by her father's doings. That's not fair. He stormed out of the kitchen, his heart pounding. He grabbed Lilian's hand, his touch gentle but firm. Let's go, he said, his voice low. Marlene, her face pale and stricken, timidly peered around the wall, following them out with her eyes. As they reached the door, Lilian turned back, offering a polite smile. Goodbye, Mrs. Bradley, she said, her voice sweet and sincere. They sat in Camden's car, the silence hanging heavy between them. He apologized profusely, his voice filled with genuine remorse. I'm so sorry, Lilian, he said, his heart aching for her. My mother had no right to say those things. Lilian laughed it off, but Camden could see the pain behind her eyes. It's okay, Camden, she said, her voice resigned. It's the price I pay for being Cassidy's daughter. They drove back to her house, the tension palpable. When they arrived, Lilian kicked off her shoes and went to the kitchen. She returned with 2 wine bottles, one red and one white, and 2 glasses. She sat next to Camden on the couch, tucking her legs to the side. Camden, desperate to break the ice, took a deep breath and confessed, "I followed you today, Lilian." He watched her carefully, bracing for her reaction. She didn't seem surprised, just more ashamed. "I figured," she said softly, avoiding his gaze. Another silence descended between them, thick with unspoken words and buried emotions. Then Lilian spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to get out, Camden," she said, her eyes filled with despair. "My father controls me. I just follow what I'm told to do." She continued, her voice trembling. "I don't know the details, and I'm not allowed to leave. He watches me, and if I don't listen, he reminds me that he's kept me safe all this time." Camden reached out and took her hand, his touch offering comfort and reassurance. He pulled her close, and she buried her head in his chest, her body shaking with quiet sobs. He held her tight, stroking her hair, whispering words of comfort, promising her that everything would be all right. He felt a surge of protectiveness towards her, a fierce determination to rescue her from the clutches of her father. She lifted her head to speak, her words broken by sobs. Tears streamed down her crimson cheeks, tracing delicate paths through the smudges of her mascara. The sight of her vulnerability, of her raw pain, stirred something deep within Camden, a potent mix of compassion and desire. He reached out, his hand cupping her face gently, and he kissed her. Her eyes widened in shock for only a fleeting second. Then, as if a dam had broken, she passionately kissed him back, pulling his face into hers with a desperate intensity. The kiss, a fervent joining of souls seeking solace and connection, her lips soft as velvet, yielding to his touch, and his own responded with an eagerness born of longing and tenderness. Their tongues met in a dance of unspoken desires, a silent language of need and longing. His hands, strong and sure, caressed her face, tracing the delicate curve of her cheekbones. the soft line of her jaw, her own hands trembling slightly, clutching at his shirt, her fingers digging into the fabric as if seeking to anchor herself to him, to promise the safety and warmth that he offered. In that kiss, time ceased to exist. They were lost in a world of their own making, a world where only their hearts and souls mattered. It was a kiss of desperation, a kiss of hope, a kiss that spoke of a love that defied logic and reason. It was a kiss that held the promise of the future, a future where they could be free from the shadows of the past. Their souls, once adrift in a tempest of turmoil, now found harbour in the sweetest haven of each other's embrace. Her fear, a ravenous beast that had long gnawed at her spirit, retreated, its claws blunted by the warmth of his affection. His resolve, like a sharpened blade, found new purpose in the knowledge that he was not only fighting for justice, but for her heart as well. Their intertwined fates, once disparate threads, now wove together into a tapestry of longing and liberation, bound by the unwavering promise of devotion. But just as quickly as it had begun, the kiss ended. Lilian pushed Camden away, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and regret. She got to her feet, her movements frantic as she tried to fix her disheveled appearance. She wiped away the tears that still streamed down her face, her hands trembling as she smoothed down her dress. Lilian, her voice trembling, spoke. "Camden, I'm not saying no," she stammered. "I'm only saying not tonight." Camden, though his heart ached with longing, respected her boundaries. He nodded slowly, a gentle understanding in his eyes. He rose to his feet, his movements careful and deliberate. He leaned down and kissed her softly on the forehead, his touch lingering for a moment. Then, without another word, he made his way out of the house, leaving her alone with her thoughts. As he drove through town, a torrent of thoughts raged within him. He replayed the kiss, the vulnerability he had seen in Lilian's eyes, the desperation in her touch. He was torn between his desire for her, his determination to protect her, and his unwavering commitment to bring her father to justice. He knew that he was walking a dangerous path, one that could lead to heartbreak, betrayal, or even death. Then, under the illumination of the streetlights, as he made his way across town, he spotted what he thought was Lilian's car passing in the opposite direction. His heart skipped a beat. He took a while to navigate a legal U-turn, his anxiety growing with each passing second. He sped up, trying to catch up, but he couldn't find her car. He was starting to panic, his imagination running wild with possibilities. Just when he was about to give up, he spotted Cassidy's car instead. He decided to follow it, his instincts telling him that it would lead him to something important. Cassidy's car led him to Macon Machinery. Camden parked at a distance. He pulled his gun from the glove compartment and gripped the pistol firmly. He crept in the dark towards the shop, going into the alley that led to the side entrance, where a light was flickering. He knew Cassidy was inside the shop. Camden edged closer, his gun drawn to his side, his senses on high alert. Just when he was considering his next move, the steel side door swung open, and Cassidy walked out into the alley. He stood directly under the flickering light, his face illuminated by its harsh glare. They stood only feet apart. Cassidy was holding an envelope in his hand, his expression calm and composed. He looked at Camden and smiled a cheeky smile. Camden saw the envelope, his mind piecing together the puzzle. The reality of the situation hit him hard, and all the anger, all the thoughts of his father, and knowing what Cassidy was doing to Lilian, drew him to point his firearm at Cassidy. Cassidy's smile turned smoky, almost knowing, and he started to speak. Camden. But his words were interrupted by 3 loud bangs that shattered the night. Cassidy's body was thrown back, his body hitting the ground with a solid thud. Camden, adrenaline coursing through his veins, looked around wildly to see if anyone had witnessed the shooting. He rushed to open the steel door and peered inside the shop, but he saw nobody there. His hands trembling, he took out his phone and dialed it in. The next day, Camden entered the precinct to a standing ovation. His colleagues cheered, clapped him on the back, and congratulated him on a job well done. He felt a surge of pride and accomplishment, basking in the adulation. He took a victory lap, smiling and shaking hands, before heading to Captain Reynolds' office. Reynolds, a rare smile on his face, greeted him warmly. He was informed that Cassidy was found with an envelope containing $34,000 in cash. The money was later traced back to Douglas and Caitlin Thrasher, the owners of Macomb Machinery. Further investigation revealed that the Thrashers had paid off Cassidy to break into the premises and rob them of high-value items. They planned to claim the items on their insurance policy and then have them returned to them later. A classic case of insurance fraud. Both Douglas and Caitlin Thrasher were taken into custody, and things weren't looking good for Dave Duster either. His involvement was being investigated, and it seemed likely that he would be implicated in the scheme as well. The Marshall case was officially closed, and Camden was hailed as a hero. The official report stated that Cassidy had lunged at Camden while trying to grab his gun, forcing Camden to defend himself. As a result of his bravery and dedication, Camden was promoted straight to sergeant, becoming the youngest in the precinct's history. He had achieved everything he had set out to do. He had avenged his father, brought down Cassidy to justice, and earned the respect of his colleagues. Despite the accolades and praise, Camden couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was amiss. He felt terrible for taking Lilian's father away, even though he knew he had done the right thing. That Cassidy had been a menace to Macomb for far too long. At his ceremony over the weekend, where the mayor presented him with his Medal of Honor, as well as his sergeant ranking, he felt a surge of pride, more than he thought possible. It was a moment of triumph, a validation of his sacrifices and hard work. He searched for his mother in the crowd, wanting to share the moment with her, but he couldn't find her. He knew she had been there earlier. He had seen her beaming face as he had walked onto the stage. After the fanfare, while still dressed in his ceremonial uniform, He called his mother. Her voice on the other end of the line was barely audible, choked with sobs. He could barely make out her words, but he managed to understand that she was close to the railway crossing by the station downtown. A wave of panic washed over Camden. He raced his car and sped towards the location. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. He arrived at the railway crossing, his heart pounding. He spotted his mother leaning against the tree, her gaze fixed on a distant field. Her shoulders were shaking with silent sobs, and she looked lost and forlorn. As Camden got closer, he realized that his mother wasn't looking at a field at all, but across the cemetery. He could see a gathering of people, and then he recognized the familiar shape of a casket. Cassidy was having his funeral conducted. A wave of nausea washed over Camden, followed by a surge of anger. He straightened his uniform, not with pride, but with uncomfortable shame. He approached his mother, his voice stern. "What are you doing here, Mom?" Marlene didn't respond at first, her gaze fixed on the funeral procession. Then she turned to Camden, her eyes filled with a lifetime of regret. "I couldn't take it any longer, Camden," she said. She spoke in riddles at first, her words disjointed and confusing. But when Camden pressed her, she finally confessed the truth. A truth that shattered his world into a million pieces. "Cassidy and I were high school sweethearts, Camden," she said, her voice trembling. "We were madly in love." She paused, her eyes filling with tears. "We broke up after school, went our separate ways. But soon after I married Daniel, we started having an affair." Camden was stunned, his mind reeling. "An affair?" he repeated. Marlene nodded, her face etched with pain. "It was wrong, I know," she said, her voice cracking. "But I couldn't help myself. I loved him so much." She continued, "It was actually Cassidy who told me to name our child Camden. He loved the name." Camden was confused and enraged, his emotions warring within him. He grabbed his mother's arm, his grip tight. "What about my father, Daniel?" he demanded, his voice trembling with anger. "What did he know?" Marlene's face crumpled, and she began to sob uncontrollably. "Daniel always suspected," she said, her voice breaking. "He did everything he could to keep Cassidy away from me. He was a good man. Camden, I loved him dearly. But the morning Daniel found out that you weren't his son, that was the morning you and he were leaving for your fishing trip." She paused, her voice barely a whisper. That day, I had never seen Daniel that angry. Yet, he promised to take you fishing, so that's what he would do. Marlene continued, her voice trembling. In town, he sees Cassidy, confronts him, and Daniel clearly bit off more than he could chew. Daniel was a good man, and I will always love him for that. But Cassidy was my true love. Camden was utterly disgusted by his mother's confession. His heart filled with a mixture of revulsion and disbelief. He could barely look at her, his mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of her betrayal. "Before I slap you," he spat, his voice trembling with barely contained rage, "I should leave. You wretched excuse of a woman." He turned and stormed towards his car, his body shaking with anger. His mother called out, pleading for him to stop, but he ignored her, slamming the door shut and speeding away. The rest of the weekend was a painful blur. Camden was tormented by the weight of his actions, by the realization that he had killed his real father, who was unarmed. He struggled to reconcile the image of Cassidy as a criminal mastermind with the image of him as a passionate lover, a man who had captured his mother's heart. He struggles to deal with what all of that meant for him and Lilian. He had no contact with Lilian, fearing the impact of his mother's revelation on their relationship. Was their connection real? When Monday came about, he had ignored every effort his mother made to contact him. He sat at his desk, staring at the ceiling, his mind consumed by the events of the past few days. He was lost in a sea of confusion and regret, unsure of what to do next. Nancy tapped on his door, her voice hesitant. "Sergeant Bradley," she asked, "can I come in?" Camden sighed, pushing himself upright in his chair. "Yeah, come in, Nancy," he said, his voice weary. Nancy entered the office, her expression filled with concern. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked, her eyes scanning his face. "You look empty, and your eyes are dark." Camden forced a weak smile, trying to project an air of normalcy. "I'm fine, Nancy," he said, his voice flat. "Just a long weekend. What do you need?" Nancy hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about the Cassidy case, sir," she said, her brow furrowed. "Something's been bothering me." "What is it?" Camden asked, his voice devoid of enthusiasm. "It's about the brown envelope," Nancy said, her eyes meeting his. "The one Cassidy was found with. Doesn't it seem a little peculiar?" Camden frowned. "Peculiar, how so?" "It was a payoff, plain and simple." Nancy shook her head. "But didn't Lilian already collect a brown envelope that same day? The day we followed her?" Camden slowly sat up straighter in his chair, his mind beginning to churn. He replayed the events of that day in his head. The image of Lilian collecting the envelope from Macon machinery flashing before his eyes. He also thought back to the envelope Lilian collected at Mahogany Memories from Dave. It could have been a second collection, Camden suggested. Nancy shot back. "How could that be, sir? Doesn't make sense." "Why?" "You mentioned possibly seeing Lilian's car in town, even though you had left her at her house." She paused, her expression serious. "That's not right, right?" The weight of her words hit Camden hard. He had entrusted Nancy with that information. The fact that he saw Lilian's car and didn't mention it in his report. He didn't want to bring her in too deep for his sake, but he trusted her. Something was definitely off. Camden's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information, the inconsistencies, the unanswered questions. He knew that Nancy was right. Something wasn't adding up, and Lilian was at the center of it. They jumped in a police without a word and sped towards Cassidy's movements decisive. Their sirens silent. Let's go, he said to Nancy, clear, his voice firm. When they arrived, they found Gary, the mechanic, working on a car in the garage. Gary, Camden called out, his voice sharp. Where's Lilian? Gary looked up, his eyes widening with surprise. Lilian came in early this morning, he said, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. She told us she'd only be in tomorrow. Said she's still in mourning. Nancy, ever observant, chimed in. Did you attend the funeral, Gary? Gary hesitated for a moment, his expression shifting uneasily. No, he said, his voice low. Lilian didn't want me there. The way he said it, the hesitation in his voice, piqued Camden's curiosity. He stepped closer to Gary, his gaze intense. Why would there be an issue with you being seen at the funeral of your boss, Gary? He asked, his voice low and menacing. Nancy's eyes widened with sudden realization, her mouth opening in a silent scream of discovery. She finally figured something out. Camden quickly interjected, cutting her off before she could say anything. Not here, he barked. He didn't want to risk anyone overhearing their conversation, especially if it involved Lilian. He didn't know who he could trust anymore. Camden stepped even closer to Gary, his presence dominating the smaller man. He lowered his voice even further, his words a stern whisper. Get in the car, Gary. Gary nervously wiped his hands with the rag, his eyes darting between the two officers. With a hesitant nod, he slowly followed them to the police cruiser. They drove the cruiser towards the cemetery, the silence broken only by the hum of the engine. and the nervous breathing of Gary in the back seat. Camden felt a growing sense of unease. The tranquility of the scenery, a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. The distance from Cassidy made him uneasy. He parked the car on a secluded side road, the headstones looming in the distance. He turned to face Gary, his expression grim. Camden knew he couldn't take this to the precinct. "Gary," he said, his voice low and menacing, "you're in a lot of trouble. You need to consider saving yourself now. Tell us everything, and maybe, just maybe, we can cut you a deal." Nancy, sensing the opportunity, jumped in on the game. "He's right, Gary," she said, her voice firm. "Confess now, and we can offer you some salvation." She leaned forward, her eyes locking with Gary's. "We know it was you driving Lilian's car that night, Gary. Don't lie to us." Gary, sweating profusely, wrung his hands nervously. "Yes," he stammered, his voice trembling. "It was me. But do you promise to protect me? I need your protection. That's the only way I'll talk. My life is on the line." He was visibly terrified, his fear palpable. Camden scoffed. "Cassidy can't get to you anymore, Gary," he said, trying to reassure him. "He's dead." Gary looked confused, his eyes darting between the two officers. "I'm not talking about Cassidy," he said. "I'm talking about Lilian." He took a deep breath and began to explain, his words tumbling out in a rush. "The entire syndicate. It was run by Lilian. She started it. She implemented it. Your questioning of Cassidy at the pub got him worried about his daughter, as he had left the criminal life decades ago. He said Cassidy confronted her, where she denied it." Gary then explained that Lilian would approach business owners who were going through financial tough times. She would offer to help them by robbing their stores for cash, allowing them to claim the losses on their insurance, and then having their goods returned at a later stage. And if the owners weren't willing to cooperate, she would threaten them. I would then be instructed on how to get into the stores without triggering the alarm, he continued, his voice trembling, and which items to take. Camden, his mind reeling, asked about the time he and Nancy followed Lilian and Cassidy to make a machinery. Gary laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. Cassidy was following Lilian to see what she was up to, he said. She didn't even know he was following her until Officer Bradley told her. Camden corrected him automatically, his pride momentarily overshadowing his shock. Sergeant Bradley, he said, his voice tight. Both Nancy and Gary just looked at him, their expressions a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Nancy, her mind sharp and focused, steered the conversation back to the present. Gary, tell us about the other night, she pressed. What happened after you picked up Lilian's car? Gary hesitated for a moment, then continued, his voice trembling. As previously planned, I was supposed to fetch Lilian's car, he said. She thought my truck might become too common on the scene of these burglaries. Nancy, ever the stickler for accuracy, corrected him. Insurance fraud, Gary, she said, her voice firm. That's what we are talking about here. Gary paused, his brow furrowed. Technically, it's a burglary on my part. Up until the claim is made, he mumbled. Camden, his patience wearing thin, rebuked Gary sharply. Enough with the semantics, Gary, he snapped. Just tell us what happened. Gary sat upright in fear, his eyes darting nervously between the two officers. Right, he stammered. I drove the car into town, heading to make a machinery. I was supposed to drive around the building a few times as a security check before proceeding with the plan. He paused, his voice barely audible. But just when I was about to park the car, I heard gunshots. Camden, his frustration mounting, couldn't contain himself any longer. What was Cassidy doing there, Gary? He demanded, his voice laced with anger. Gary swallowed hard, his eyes pleading. Lilian told me later, he said, his voice trembling, that after I had fetched the car, Cassidy arrived immediately after and demanded that she stop her plan. He told her that if she didn't, he would be forced to report her to the police. He continued. He demanded all the money back so that he could return it to the Thrashers and cancel the deal. He knew I was already on the way, so he attempted to catch me before I could execute the burglary. Camden's head sank into his chest, his body slumping with utter defeat. He was devastated by the revelation, by the realization that he had murdered an innocent man, a man who was only trying to help his daughter, his own father. He had killed Cassidy, who had tried to take a stand against Lilian, and was going to confess everything to the police, with the money to fix it, just as Gary was to perform the burglary. Camden would have been a hero either way, as Cassidy would have handed him the money back and given evidence. Now the truth was clear. He knew he should have stayed away, or have handed the case over, given his father's deep involvement. He had been blinded by his own prejudices, by his desire to avenge his father, and by his infatuation with Lilian. Camden, overwhelmed by guilt and despair, began to weep. His body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. The weight of his actions, the enormity of his mistake, crashed down upon him, crushing his spirit. As he wept, he turned to Gary, his voice choked with emotion. "Get out," he said, his voice barely audible. Gary, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, hesitated. "Am I in trouble, officer? I mean, Sergeant," he stammered. Camden's anger flared, his voice intensifying. "Get out," he roared, his words laced with venom. Gary, terrified, scrambled out the cruiser, his face pale with fear. He scurried away, disappearing into the shadows of the cemetery. As Camden continued to sob, Nancy, her heart filled with compassion, she placed a gentle hand on his arm, her touch offering silent support. Camden recoiled sharply, dismissing her hand with a violent gesture. "What are you doing?" he barked, his voice harsh and unforgiving. Nancy, caught off guard by his sudden outburst, recoiled in shock, her eyes widening with hurt and confusion. Camden wiped away his tears, his expression hardening into a mask of cold indifference. He stared out at the cemetery, his gaze fixed on the distant headstones. He informed her, his voice devoid of emotion. The case was solved and closed last week, Nancy, he said. There's no point in ruining reputations any further, causing unnecessary harm. We should move on from this. No point in tarnishing the credibility of the precinct by throwing around fresh accusations. Back at the precinct, Camden sat in his office, staring at his framed award, the medal glinting. But its shine felt dull, almost mocking. He thought, it's all I have now. An internal monologue began, swirling with the sorrow of regret. It's gone. All of it slipped through my fingers like sand. Lilian. The thought of her is now a poisoned dart. What was blooming felt so true, so pure. I can't even trust that now. And knowing what I know now, that bond, that connection, defiled. It's my burden now, isn't it? To carry this secret, to keep that truth from her, for her own sake. Stay away, Camden. Stay far away. Mom, she's a ghost. A stranger in her own skin, in my life. How can I look at her again? How can I forgive? And Cassidy. I wanted him in a certain way. A monster. It made it easier, didn't it? But maybe there was more. A chance, perhaps, for something different. Now that's gone too. Snuffed out by my own hand. Dad, was any of it real? Did he suspect? Did he suffer? I wanted to avenge him, but what was I avenging? A lie. It all led here, didn't it? This desk, this badge, the hollow echo of duty. Is that enough? Is this all I am? A cop, a sergeant, nothing else.